There's a line where blind trust collides with devastating betrayal. It's there in the no man's land between the purest hope and brutal reality that the dream of a future together shatters into 1,000 digital pieces, revealing that the greatest crossing wasn't a physical border, but a broken heart. Where are you watching us from? Have you ever placed your future, your very soul, in the hands of someone who swore to love you beyond any border, beyond any distance? Or have you ever felt the ground vanish beneath your feet, your life turned upside down by an unexpected revelation, a blow that seemed to come from the deepest abyss of falsehood? Share your story, your perspective, in the comments below. Help us amplify voices that are often silenced by shame, pain, or distance. Like this video, so this narrative of courage and disillusionment can reach hearts that need to know they're not alone. This video is a work of fiction inspired by countless real-life accounts of individuals facing unimaginable challenges when crossing borders in search of a better future. Amidst this vulnerability, they are exposed to emotional and physical risks, including those within relationships. We do not encourage illegal immigration and strongly warn about the extreme dangers, traps, and vulnerabilities involved in this process. Many lives have been lost, many hearts broken. Our primary goal is to generate empathy, promote deep reflection, and shed light on the emotional complexities and real consequences of these journeys. We firmly support legal and safe immigration. For reliable information and humanitarian support, please refer to the QR code or link provided in the description. Her name was Sofia, and her brown eyes, as deep as the wells in her small village, carried the sweetness and stubbornness of the golden wheat fields that stretched to the horizon in her rural hometown. Her soul was embroidered with simple dreams, but the most vivid and urgent one bore the face, voice, and laugh of Miguel. They met virtually in an online group where people from different countries connected, seeking new opportunities, friendships, and for some, even a new love. Conversations between Sofia and Miguel stretched through countless nights, starting with text messages and then moving to hesitant video calls, which soon blossomed into long sessions filled with laughter and confidences. They defied the language barrier with online translators and the relentless distance between their continents with the persistence of lonely hearts. Miguel, with his kind words, his captivating smile in the photos he sent, and vivid promises of a sunny, prosperous future in a distant land, had ignited in Sofia a hope that had long seemed dormant, suffocated by the monotony, the brutal scarcity, and the stagnation of a life without prospects. Her greatest dream wasn't just to escape the poverty, the lack of access to basic services, and the daily humiliation that stifled her humble existence. It was to build a home, a secure nest, alongside the man who made her feel seen, valued, and deeply loved, even if only through a cold screen. Sofia dreamed of candle-lit dinners for two in a brightly lit kitchen, of the laughter of children who would have Miguel's sparkling eyes, of the financial and emotional stability she had never known. She pictured small details, a garden, a dog, movie nights at home. Her unbreakable connection with her grandmother, Elena, was her safe harbor, the strongest bond tying her to her land, her past, her very identity. Elena, with her hands wrinkled by time and wise from years lived, represented history, tradition, and resilience. But ironically, it was Elena who most encouraged her to pursue this promised happiness, even if it meant crossing borders, defying the unknown, risking everything. If your heart guides you, my granddaughter, follow it with courage and faith, but never forget where you came from, Elena would say, never imagining the whirlwind of emotions, the real dangers, and the unimaginable betrayal this journey would bring. Elena trusted the promise of love Sofia swore she had found, for she wanted to see her granddaughter happy, free from the same life of deprivation she herself had known. Sofia's reason for leaving was a tight, multifaceted knot in her chest, an urgent mix of grand dreams and suffocating desperation. It wasn't just the lack of opportunities in her town, where young people watch their dreams wither like unwatered flowers, their ambitions fading in the exhausting routine of ill-paid odd jobs and the daily struggle for survival. It was, above all, Miguel's ardent promise, the almost tangible vision of a marriage, of a new life where her smiles would be more frequent than the silent tears she shed at night, feeling trapped, invisible, and without a future. He had sworn to wait for her on the other side, help her settle, find a good job, and finally formalize the love that had blossomed between them virtually, making it real and tangible. The sudden illness of a dear neighbor, who wasted away and died due to lack of access to proper expensive medical treatment, underscored the fragility of the life she knew, propelling her forward with desperate urgency. Not just poverty, but the daily humiliation of not being able to afford the basics for herself and to help her grandmother. The constant shadow of debt, overdue rent, and empty plates that crushed her dignity. All of this coalesced with Miguel's promise, which shone like a beacon in the deepest darkness. The day came when the decision became irreversible, burned into her soul with indelible ink. She sold her few sentimental belongings, her late mother's simple jewelry, an old radio inherited from her father, anything that had value to gather the money for the trip. She bid Elena a long, tight farewell hug, swallowing the tears that stubbornly fell, trying to be strong for her grandmother, who wept silently. Sofia promised to call as soon as she arrived, as soon as she was safe in Miguel's arms. She embarked on an uncertain journey, carrying only a small, worn backpack, a few meager keepsakes, and Miguel's smiling photograph as a talisman, a shield against the paralyzing fear she felt. The sweet illusion of a guaranteed future, of a true and unconditional love waiting for her, was her only compass, her only anchor. Her last look at her home, at the small window where she used to see her grandmother sewing by the flickering candlelight, was a devastating mix of piercing pain and an almost blind, almost insane hope. The door to her known life closed forever, and another, unknown and dangerous, opened to a future that she, in her passionate and desperate naivete, believed would be promising and secure. That night, the cold wind of parting blew across her face, but the warmth of Miguel's promises still enveloped her, granting her a supernatural courage for the first steps into the darkness of uncertainty. The crossing began as a waking nightmare, an ordeal of human endurance that seemed endless. It wasn't just kilometers, but interminable miles of agony under a merciless sun that cracked her skin, parched her throat, and blurred her vision. Sofia joined a group of equally desperate faces, some young like her, others parents, all united by a thin thread of hope and despair. Guided by coyotes, with hard eyes, impenetrable features, and empty promises that dissolved in the arid air. Every step was a stab, the rough, rocky ground tearing at her feet, sharp stones piercing the soles of her worn, already tattered shoes. Hunger gnawed from within, a constant aching emptiness that hurt more than the festering blisters on her feet. It wasn't just the absence of food, but the feeling that her body was consuming itself, devouring itself to survive, every muscle fiber wasting away. Every ounce of energy came at a cost, a silent negotiation with the exhaustion that threatened to fell her at any moment, turning her muscles to jelly. Thirst was an even greater torture, an agony that brought her to the brink of hallucination. Her mouth dry, tongue swollen and rough as sandpaper, vision blurry, body crying out for a single drop of water. In moments of desperation, she dreamed of a glass of ice-cold water, of the sensation of pure water running down her parched throat, washing away the dust and bitterness. Fear was a parasite that clung to her muscles, paralyzing them at the most inopportune moments, sending icy shivers down her spine. fear of border guards who appeared as imposing shadows, of criminals lurking in the shadows of dry bushes, of wild animals that prowled at night, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. But the greatest fear, the one that kept her awake during the few hours of rest, was that of failure, of not reaching Miguel, of all that sacrifice, all that pain, being in vain, turning into a cruel joke. With every strange rustle in the brush, her heart pounded like a drum in her chest, panic seizing her mind. Sickness, silent and insidious, lurked in every dubious puddle they dared to drink from, in every freezing night spent under the open sky, without shelter. A dry, persistent cough settled in her chest, stealing her breath, each inhale becoming a painful effort, tearing at her lungs. There were days when her body seemed to give up, her legs wobbly, her mind clouded by fever, utterly exhausted. She saw others give up, abandoned to their fate, their weak bodies left behind, and their image was a constant reminder of life's fragility, of the journey's cruelty. Dangerous encounters were constant, testing not only her physical strength, but her morals and her soul. Strange men with predatory eyes, offering help in exchange for favors that made her shudder, her body reacting with a cold shiver of repulsion. She had to learn to say no, to flee, to hide under the cover of night, to crawl on the ground, to trust only herself in an environment where trust was a dangerous and almost non-existent luxury. There was a moment when one of her journey companions, a young father with a faded photo of his daughter, fell gravely ill. The coyote refused to wait, threatening to abandon him on the trail, at the mercy of the elements and death. Sofia, with the little water she had left, insisted on staying with him for a few hours, sharing her last sip, her last piece of a hard biscuit. It was a difficult choice, a real risk to her own crossing, to her own safety, but the humanity within her, the memory of her grandmother Elena, refused to simply abandon a fellow sufferer. Her willpower manifested in every small act of resistance, every time she refused to succumb to despair, every time she forced herself to take another step, even when her feet screamed for rest. Her intimate thoughts were a constant internal monologue, almost a mental diary of her exhausted soul, an incessant whisper in her mind. She wondered what would happen to Elena, alone at home, waiting for news that might never come. Was Miguel thinking of her, missing her? Was he still waiting for her, eager for her arrival? The doubts were insidious whispers in the darkness of the night, amplified by the howling wind. But amidst all the torment, small and desperate hopes sustained her, fragments of light that prevented total darkness. A timid ray of sun breaking through the clouds at dawn, a piece of stale bread offered by a kind stranger in a ghost town, the memory of Elena's gentle smile, Miguel's voice whispering promises of love in her mind, repeating the tender words he had spoken. Each of these fragments of hope was a brick in the wall she built against despair, a reminder that there was something to fight for, something waiting for her on the other side. Every step was a struggle, every breath came at a cost, every drop of sweat a silent tear. But the image of Miguel and the promised future was the flickering flame that kept her moving, step by step, towards her uncertain destiny, driven by a faith that would, painfully, prove to be illusory. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, weeks of trials that stretched like centuries of agony, Sofia felt that freedom, Miguel's promise, was within her grasp. She had crossed, or was about to cross, the invisible line that separated her personal hell from her long-dreamed-of paradise. Exhausted, wounded, her body aching in every muscle and joint, yet with a renewed hope burning like an ember in her chest, she managed to reach a small village on the other side of the border. It was a place where help for migrants was subtle, almost a whisper, but real and welcome. Her first and only thought, an obsession that consumed her, was to find a place with internet, a phone, any means to let Miguel know she had arrived. that the odyssey was over. Her heart pounded erratically, a symphony of anxiety, relief, and euphoria. He was waiting for her, he promised. By this point, her phone battery had died days ago, and communication had been impossible. All she wanted was to hear his voice, to feel the confirmation, the validation that it had all been worth it, that the sacrifice had been rewarded. With the last few coins she had left, crumpled and sweat-soaked, Sofia found a small, dimly lit cafe with a weak but present Wi-Fi signal. Her hands trembled uncontrollably as she powered on the old device a kind volunteer lent her. The screen lit up with a pale, almost dying light. The first thing she did was try to access the social media network where she and Miguel had communicated, where their promises had been exchanged and cemented. The screen loaded slowly, each pixel forming an agonizing torture for her already depleted patience. And then, there it was, not a message from Miguel, not a missed call, not the long-awaited confirmation of his love. What jumped out at her was a recently published photo album by a mutual friend. The title, in bold, cruel letters, echoed in her mind, "The happiest day of our lives." Sofia felt the air stolen from her lungs with sudden violence, as if an invisible fist had closed over her windpipe. Her hands froze on the dusty keyboard, her fingers inert. The first photo showed Miguel, not as she knew him virtually, but radiant in a pristine suit that seemed to glow. Beside him, it wasn't her, but a stunning woman in a flowing white veil, a resplendent smile on her face, a bouquet of white flowers in her hands, held with the delicacy of a bride. It was a wedding, Miguel's wedding. He had gotten married. The photos scrolled by, one after another, a parade of visual cruelty, the passionate kiss at the altar, the knowing glances, the clinking champagne flutes, the newlywed dance, the joy plastered across the guests' faces. Each image was a shard of glass, embedding deeper and deeper into her already wounded soul. The protagonist, Sofia, didn't just witness that moment, she was torn apart, dismembered by it. Her worst nightmare wasn't the border, the hunger, the fear, the sickness, but the most abject and calculated betrayal. The man who had made her cross a physical hell in search of a promised paradise was, at that very moment, living his own paradise with another woman, while she withered with hope and exhaustion. The scream caught in her throat, a tight knot that choked her, that prevented oxygen from reaching her lungs. The cafe, the chatter of people around her, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, everything vanished, turning into a distant hum. The ground opened beneath her feet, and she felt her body give way, as if every bone, every muscle, every tendon refused to support her for another second. She staggered, desperately clinging to the rustic wooden table to keep from falling, her eyes fixed, wide, disbelieving, on the screen displaying the proof of her ruin, as tears streamed uncontrollably, mixing with the dirt and accumulated sweat of her insane journey. The emotional collapse was palpable, an earthquake in her very being. Her face contorted into a mask of pure pain, her lips trembling uncontrollably, murmuring, "No, it can't be." Feelings of guilt flooded her like a giant wave. I should have suspected. I was so stupid, so blind by illusion. How could I have been so naive? The powerlessness was overwhelming, paralyzing. She had risked everything, abandoned her life, her grandmother, faced death at every step, for a lie, for a ghost. Deep despair manifested in every cell of her being. She felt a physical pain in her chest, as if her heart was being crushed by an invisible press, her lungs refusing to work. Her breath hitched, cold sweat trickled down her forehead. Chills coursed through her exhausted body. She couldn't tear her gaze from those photos, from Miguel's smile, which now seemed mocking, cruel, a sneer at her pain. There was no anger in her initial reaction, only an abysmal void, a sharp pain that pierced her, tearing her from the inside out. Everything she had endured, every drop of sweat, every blister on her feet, every night of terror, every silent prayer, it had all been for a phantom, a cruel illusion, a sandcastle built on falsehood. That moment wasn't just the loss of a love, it was the loss of her own dignity, her faith in humanity, the very reason for her existence on the other side of the border. It was the end of everything she believed in, everything that had driven her there. The sound of wedding bells in her mind was the requiem for her dreams. That day, Sofia's world collapsed. She didn't return to the street immediately. She couldn't. She remained in the cafe, paralyzed in her seat, tears dry on her face, while images of Miguel's wedding replayed in her mind like a never-ending horror film. The volunteer who had helped her earlier, a middle-aged man with kind eyes, noticed her catatonic state and, patiently, wordlessly, took her in. There were no invasive questions, just a supportive shoulder and a glass of fresh water. Simple gestures that were worth more than 1,000 words in that moment of utter devastation. Sofia didn't get over losing Miguel, nor the betrayal. The pain of disillusionment and the pointless sacrifice was too heavy a burden to simply leave behind, like an empty backpack. She learned to live with it, to carry it like an invisible but deeply painful scar that throbbed with every memory. Rebuilding her life wasn't an instant cure, but a slow, arduous process happening in small yet significant symbolic acts of resistance. In her first few months after the tragedy, Sofia spent hours writing letters. Letters to Miguel, which would never be sent, for she had nowhere to send them and no one to send them to. In them she poured out her pain, her anger, her incomprehension, every comma laden with bitterness. But gradually, the tone of the letters shifted. They ceased to be accusations and became a diary of her own resilience, a record of her internal journey of survival. They spoke of grief, yes, of the loss of an idealized future, but also of the hope that stubbornly blossomed amidst the ruins of her heart. They represented her memory, not Miguel's memory, but the memory of who she was before, naive and full of blind faith, and who she was becoming, a woman who had survived betrayal and the hell of the crossing, a phoenix rising from the ashes of her own burned dreams. The letters became her private sanctuary, a place to process the unthinkable and to reaffirm her own existence, to find herself amidst the chaos. Finding strength in faith wasn't a sudden miracle, a light that illuminated everything overnight, but an arduous journey of self-discovery, questioning, and acceptance. Sofia clung to the small St. Barbara medal that Elena, her grandmother, had given her at their farewell, to the promise that God never abandons his children, even in the darkest hours. She found solace in the stories of other migrants who had also been deceived, who had lost so much, money, documents, dreams, or their own innocence, but who still found a way to move forward, to pick themselves up. She integrated into a small support community that formed among those who had crossed the border, a group of people who understood her pain without the need for many words. Her voice, once so full of fear and hesitation, began to strengthen, first in whispers, then in firm assertions. The peak of her transformation, the moment the victim became a messenger, was when she decided that her pain, her suffering, would not be in vain. Sofia began to share her story, timidly at first, then with growing conviction, feeling it was her duty, her new mission. She didn't want other women to fall into the same trap, deluded by empty promises and the glamour of a future that only existed in the virtual world, far from the cruelty of reality. She became a messenger, a voice of warning about the dangers, not just of the physical crossing and the risks of the journey, but of the emotional vulnerability that accompanies the desperate search for a better life, for love. She guided, warned about fake profiles, about promises that seemed too good to be true, about the need for caution and to verify information. Her testimony to someone about to make the same fatal decision based on a virtual romance built on sand could be the difference between life, safety, and a devastating disillusionment that could cost everything. The border doesn't just divide countries, Sofia realized with bitterness and wisdom. It divides souls, separates what is real from what is illusion, reveals the true face of people and dreams. She was no longer the same naive Sofia who left that remote village, that girl full of blind faith and innocent hope. But she was a stronger, more resilient Sofia, with a purpose she never would have imagined before. Her internal triumph after the tragedy wasn't the absence of pain, for the wound would remain, but the ability to transform that pain into something meaningful, into a legacy of awareness and protection for others. She hadn't found the romantic love that would lead to a wedding, but she found a courage and a voice that would save others, preventing them from making the same mistakes, from falling into the same traps. Pain became her only companion for a time, but then it transformed into a force that propelled her forward. What remains when you lose everything? The courage to start over, to become a guardian for those who still dream, warning them about the abysses hidden beneath the brightest promises. Thank you so much for not turning away from this reality. If this journey touched your soul, if you felt Sofia's pain, comment present or tag someone who, like the protagonist, showed courage that inspires you to keep going, even after the greatest adversities. Your voice and your empathy are essential, so these stories are not forgotten. And for more narratives like this to reach hearts and minds, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. Together we give voice to what needs to be heard, what needs to be warned about, what needs to be understood.